"My mother has the same ring," were the words that changed it all. Little did Seattle waitress Sophia Chen know that this offhand comment about a billionaire client's ring would unleash one of the largest corporate scandals in American history. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Diner buzzed overhead as 23-year-old Sophia Chen wiped down the cracked vinyl booths for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The Seattle rain drummed against the windows, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine that had been struggling to work properly for the past 6 months. Sophia's worn sneakers squeaked against the checkered linoleum floor as she moved between tables, her movements automatic after 2 years of serving coffee and dreams deferred. The medical bills from her mother's ongoing cancer treatment sat heavy in her mind, a constant weight that made every tip, every smile, every "thank you, honey" from customers feel both precious and insufficient. She glanced at the clock above the kitchen pass-through, counting down the hours until her shift at the community center's after-school program, where she taught art to kids who reminded her of herself at that age, full of hope and unaware of how quickly life could change. The diner's regulars knew her story by now, the way small communities do, offering extra tips when they could and kind words when they couldn't. But Sophia had learned to carry her struggles with quiet dignity, never letting the weight of her circumstances dim the genuine warmth she brought to every interaction. The breakfast rush had been particularly brutal that morning, with the usual crowd of construction workers, office employees grabbing coffee before their commute, and the occasional tourist who had wandered off the beaten path looking for authentic Seattle charm. Murphy's Diner provided that in spades, with its faded photographs of the city's industrial past lining the walls and the perpetual smell of bacon grease and strong coffee that seemed to have soaked into the very foundation of the building. Sophia had worked through it all with practiced efficiency, remembering orders without writing them down, anticipating needs before customers voiced them, and somehow managing to make each person feel like they were the most important customer of the day. It was a skill she had developed not just from necessity, but from genuine care for the people who shared their stories over eggs and toast, who trusted her with their complaints about bosses and their excitement about grandchildren. The bell above the door chimed, and Sophia looked up from refilling the sugar dispensers to see a man in an expensive charcoal suit step inside, shaking droplets of rain from his perfectly styled silver hair. Everything about him screamed money, from his Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Sophia made in 3 months, to the way he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never worried about rent or grocery bills. This was Marcus Blackwood, though Sophia didn't know his name yet, the tech mogul whose company had revolutionized cloud computing and whose net worth rivaled small countries' GDP. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere of the humble diner, like a sleek yacht anchoring in a fishing harbor. Other customers glanced up from their newspapers and conversations, sensing the intrusion of a different world into their comfortable working-class sanctuary. Marcus chose a corner booth, the kind that offered privacy and a view of the entire diner, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to assessing value in everything he encountered. He moved with the deliberate precision of someone whose time was measured in millions of dollars per hour, every gesture economical and purposeful. Sophia approached with her practiced smile, notepad in hand, but something made her pause mid-step. There, on his left hand, catching the diner's harsh lighting, was a ring that made her heart skip a beat. It was identical to the one her mother wore on a chain around her neck, the one treasure she had refused to sell even when the medical bills mounted and the creditors called with increasing frequency and decreasing patience. The ring was distinctive in a way that made mistaking it for anything else impossible. An intricate silver band with an engraved phoenix rising from stylized flames, its wings spread wide in a gesture of triumph or defiance, its eyes set with tiny garnets that seemed to glow with inner fire. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with details so fine they seemed to move in the shifting light. Sophia had spent countless hours as a child tracing those same details on her mother's ring, listening to stories about her grandfather and the legacy he had tried to leave behind. The sight of an identical piece on the hand of this obviously wealthy stranger sent a shock of recognition through her system that was part excitement, part confusion, and part something she couldn't quite name. "Good afternoon," Sophia said, her voice steadier than she felt as she approached the table, the familiar weight of the coffee pot in her hand grounding her in the moment. "What can I get started for you today?" Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp, the kind of gaze that missed nothing and forgave less. There was something almost predatory in the way he assessed her, as if she were a problem to be solved or an asset to be evaluated. "Black coffee," he said simply, his voice carrying the crisp authority of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. "And I'll need somewhere quiet to take a call in about 10 minutes. I assume you have somewhere more private than this?" His tone suggested that the entire diner was somehow beneath his standards, a temporary inconvenience to be endured, rather than a place where real people lived and worked. Sophia nodded, pouring the steaming coffee with practiced ease, but she couldn't stop staring at the ring. The phoenix's wings caught the light as he lifted the cup, and she felt a strange pull, as if the universe was trying to tell her something important. The rational part of her mind insisted it was just a coincidence, that wealthy people probably had access to exclusive jewelry makers who might create similar pieces, but her heart knew better. This wasn't similar. This was identical, down to the smallest detail, to the ring that represented everything her family had lost and everything her mother still hoped to reclaim. "That's a beautiful ring," she said before she could stop herself, the words tumbling out with more emotion than a casual compliment warranted. Marcus paused, his cup halfway to his lips, his gray eyes focusing on her with sudden intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. "It's been in my family for generations," he replied, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. But Sophia felt compelled to continue, driven by a force she couldn't name. The weight of her mother's stories, the medical bills that never seemed to shrink, the sense that her family had been cheated out of something important, all combined to give her a courage she didn't know she possessed. "My mother has one exactly like it," Sophia said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I mean exactly like it. Same phoenix design, same garnets, even the same inscription around the inner band. I've never seen another one like it until now." She was guessing about the inscription, but something in Marcus's expression told her she had hit the mark. The change in his demeanor was immediate and startling. His face hardened, the polite indifference replaced by something colder, more dangerous. He set his coffee cup down with deliberate precision, the small clink against the saucer sounding unnaturally loud in the suddenly tense atmosphere. "That's impossible," he said, his voice dropping to a low, controlled tone that made Sophia's skin prickle with unease. "This ring has been in the Blackwood family for over a century. It's one of a kind, commissioned by my great-great-grandfather from a master craftsman in Prague in 1924. There is no other ring like it." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and barely contained accusation. The other customers in the diner seemed to sense the shift in energy, conversations becoming quieter as people instinctively tuned in to potential drama. Sophia felt her cheeks flush, not with embarrassment, but with a rising tide of indignation that surprised her with its intensity. "Well, my mother's had hers for as long as I can remember," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "She told me it belonged to her father, my grandfather. He was a brilliant inventor, created some kind of revolutionary water purification system back in the 70s. She said the ring was a gift from a business partner, someone who believed in his work when nobody else would. She said it was the only thing of value he left behind when he died, and she's treasured it ever since." The story came out in a rush, details she hadn't thought about in years suddenly seeming crucially important. Marcus's laugh was cold and bitter, a sound that had no place in the warm, humble diner. It was the laugh of a man who had heard every sob story, every attempt at manipulation, every desperate plea for mercy or consideration. "An inventor, you say? How convenient. Let me tell you what's more likely, miss." He paused, waiting for her name with the expectation of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. There was something almost ritualistic about the way he demanded her identification, as if naming her would give him power over her. "Chen," Sophia supplied, lifting her chin slightly in defiance of his dismissive tone. "Sophia Chen." Marcus nodded as if filing the information away for future use, his mental database already cataloging her as a potential problem to be managed or eliminated. "Miss Chen, what's more likely is that your mother, or perhaps your grandfather, came into possession of a ring that didn't belong to them. The Blackwood family has extensive records of this piece, documentation that goes back nearly a century. It never left our possession, which means your mother is either mistaken about its provenance, or—" He let the sentence hang, the implication clear and insulting. "Or what?" Sophia demanded, her professional composure finally cracking as anger flared in her dark eyes. The injustice of the situation, the casual way this stranger was dismantling her family's history and honor, struck her like a physical blow. She had spent her entire life watching her mother work multiple jobs to pay for her father's medical care before he died, then watching her struggle with her own illness while refusing to burden her daughter with complaints or self-pity. The idea that this privileged man could waltz into their world and casually destroy their most treasured memories was unbearable. Marcus leaned back in the booth, his posture radiating the kind of casual cruelty that came with absolute power and no accountability. "Or your family acquired it through less than honorable means. Theft, Miss Chen. I'm suggesting your grandfather was a thief." The words hit Sophia like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her hands shake with fury. Her grandfather, Thomas Chen, had been a hero in her family's stories, a man who had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but brilliant ideas and an unshakable work ethic. He had worked in factories during the day and studied engineering at night, teaching himself English from technical manuals and building prototypes in the basement of their tiny apartment. The thought of this arrogant stranger casually destroying his memory with baseless accusations made her feel physically ill. "How dare you?" Sophia whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You don't know anything about my family or my grandfather. He was an honest man who worked hard for everything he had. He came to this country with nothing and built something beautiful, something that could have helped millions of people get clean water. Just because you're rich doesn't give you the right to insult my family's memory or make accusations you can't prove." Her voice was rising now, drawing the attention of everyone in the diner, but she didn't care. Some things were worth fighting for, worth risking embarrassment or consequences. Marcus remained unmoved by her emotional response, his expression calculating as he studied her reaction like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. "Money doesn't give me the right, Miss Chen. Facts do. And the fact is, there is only one ring like this in existence. It was made exclusively for my family, and it has never been out of our possession. Our family archives contain the original commission, correspondence with the craftsman, payment records, everything. If your mother has an identical ring, then it's either a very good fake or it was stolen from us. Those are the only logical explanations." He pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness, the expensive device gleaming in the diner's fluorescent light. "Perhaps I should have my security team look into your family's history. I'm sure they'd find the truth very interesting." The threat was clear and immediate, and Sophia felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was facing someone with the power to make her life very difficult. She had heard stories about what happened to people who crossed the ultra-wealthy, how they could use their resources to destroy careers, ruin credit, make life unbearable in ways that were perfectly legal but utterly devastating. But alongside the fear, something else burned bright and hot in her chest, a fierce protectiveness for her mother and her grandfather's memory that made her stand straighter and meet Marcus's cold gaze directly. "Do whatever you want," she said, her voice steady now, strengthened by righteous anger and the knowledge that she was fighting for something more important than her own comfort. "My family has nothing to hide. We're honest, hard-working people, and we don't need to steal from anyone to survive. We pay our bills, we help our neighbors, and we honor the memory of the people who came before us. Maybe the problem isn't that we have your ring. Maybe the problem is that your family's story isn't as clean as you think it is." The words came out with more confidence than she felt, but once they were spoken, she realized she meant every syllable. Marcus's eyes narrowed dangerously at her words, recognizing a challenge when he heard one. In his world, people didn't push back. They apologized, they accepted blame, they scrambled to make amends for perceived slights. This young waitress's defiance was both refreshing and infuriating. "Is that a threat, Miss Chen?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had intimidated board members and competitors for decades. "It's a promise," Sophia replied, surprised by her own boldness but unwilling to back down now. "If you want to investigate my family, go ahead. But maybe you should look just as hard at your own family's history. Maybe you'll find that the Blackwoods aren't as noble as you think they are." She turned to walk away, her heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. But Marcus's voice stopped her cold. "Miss Chen," he called, his tone now carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than mere disdain. Something in her words had struck a chord, awakened a doubt he hadn't expected to feel. "Tell me about this water purification system your grandfather supposedly invented. What exactly did it do?" Sophia turned back, suspicious of his sudden interest, but unable to resist the chance to defend her grandfather's legacy and perhaps plant seeds of doubt in this arrogant man's certainty. "It was revolutionary for its time," she said, her voice taking on the reverent tone she always used when speaking of her grandfather's work. "Clean, drinkable water from any source, no matter how contaminated. Rivers, lakes, even sewage could be made pure and safe. My mother said he had patents and everything, documentation proving it was his invention, but something happened in the late 70s. Some big company approached him, wanted to buy his patents for a fraction of what they were worth. When he refused, they found ways to steal his ideas anyway. Legal battles he couldn't afford, bureaucratic roadblocks, threats against his family. He died young, stress-related heart attack at 45, and my grandmother had to sell almost everything just to survive and raise my mother alone." Marcus's expression had changed subtly during her explanation, the cold dismissiveness replaced by something that looked almost like recognition, or perhaps concern. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of doubt that suggested her words had hit closer to home than either of them had expected. "What was your grandfather's full name?" he asked, his voice lacking its earlier edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like apprehension. "Thomas Chen, but everyone called him Tommy. Tommy Chen, the inventor who was going to change the world." She paused, studying his face for any sign of recognition. "Why? Does that name mean something to you?" Marcus didn't answer immediately, his gaze dropping to his ring as if seeing it for the first time, as if the familiar weight on his finger had suddenly become foreign and troubling. When he looked up again, his eyes held a complexity that hadn't been there before, a mixture of calculation and something that might have been doubt, or even fear. "I think, Miss Chen, that we both need to have some very serious conversations with our families. This situation is more complicated than either of us realized." He stood abruptly, his movements less controlled than before, leaving a $20 bill on the table for a $3 cup of coffee. The gesture somehow managed to be both generous and insulting, a reminder of the vast gulf between their worlds, even as it acknowledged that perhaps that gulf wasn't as unbridgeable as it had seemed moments before. "My card," he said, placing an elegant business card next to the money with hands that weren't quite steady. "Call me when you've spoken with your mother. I have a feeling we're going to need to work together to get to the bottom of this." As Marcus walked toward the door, his phone already pressed to his ear, Sophia could hear fragments of his conversation. Words like archives, 1970s, and Tommy Chen drifted back to her, confirming that her family's story had shaken his certainty more than he wanted to admit. As the door closed behind him, Sophia stared down at the business card in disbelief. Marcus Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer, Blackwood Technologies, with contact information that probably connected directly to one of the most powerful men in the country. She looked at the $20 bill, then at the other customers who were trying to pretend they hadn't been listening to every word, and felt the strange sensation that her entire world had just shifted on its axis. The ring her mother wore around her neck, the one she had treasured as her father's only meaningful gift, might be connected to forces far more powerful and dangerous than Sophia had ever imagined. As she cleared the table with shaking hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was just the beginning of something much larger and more complicated than a simple case of mistaken identity. The rain continued to drum against the windows, and somewhere in the city, two families were about to confront histories they thought they knew, and discover that the truth was far more tangled and painful than either had ever suspected. The drive from Murphy's diner to the modest apartment she shared with her mother felt like crossing between two different worlds, and Sophia's hands trembled on the steering wheel of her 12-year-old Honda Civic as she replayed the conversation with Marcus Blackwood over and over in her mind. The business card sat on the passenger seat like a small explosive device, its elegant typography and expensive cardstock somehow managing to make her entire car feel shabby and insufficient. She had called in sick for her afternoon shift at the community center, something she had never done before, but the weight of what had just happened made the idea of teaching finger painting to 7-year-olds feel impossibly surreal. The Seattle traffic moved in its typical sluggish patterns around her, but Sophia felt disconnected from the familiar rhythm of the city, as if she were viewing everything through glass, separated from the normal world by the magnitude of questions that suddenly demanded answers. The apartment building where she and her mother lived was a modest 3-story structure built in the 1960s, its brick facade weathered by decades of Pacific Northwest rain, but still maintaining a dignity that spoke to better economic times. Sophia had grown up in these halls, knew every creaky floorboard and temperamental light fixture, but today, even this familiar environment felt strange and uncertain. The hallway smelled of Mrs. Rodriguez's cooking from 2B and the perpetual dampness that seemed to seep through the building's aging infrastructure. Comforting scents that usually made her feel safe and grounded, but today only emphasized how small and vulnerable their world really was, in comparison to the forces they might be about to confront. Her mother, Linda Chen, was in the middle of her afternoon medication routine when Sophia burst through the apartment door, her face flushed with excitement and confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. Linda had been fighting lymphoma for 8 months now, and the treatments had left her thin and fragile, but her dark eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made her such a formidable advocate for her patients during her 20 years as a registered nurse before the illness forced her into early retirement. She was sitting at their small kitchen table, pill organizer spread out before her like a colorful puzzle, each compartment carefully labeled with days and times in her precise handwriting, when she looked up to see her daughter's distressed expression and immediately shifted into the protective mode that had sustained their family through every crisis. The kitchen was the heart of their small apartment, cramped but efficient, with vintage appliances that Linda kept spotlessly clean despite their age and the chipped Formica countertops that had seen better days. Family photos covered the refrigerator door, documenting birthdays, graduations, holidays, and quiet moments that had seemed insignificant when they were lived, but now represented a lifetime of love and resilience. Among them was her favorite picture of her father, Tommy Chen, taken just months before his death, showing him in his workshop with one of his water purification prototypes, his face glowing with the pride of an inventor who believed he was about to change the world for the better. "Sophia, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," Linda said, pushing aside her medications and giving her daughter the kind of focused attention that had always made Sophia feel like the most important person in the world. "Did something happen at work? Are you hurt? You're supposed to be at the community center right now." The concern in her mother's voice was so familiar and comforting that Sophia almost broke down right there, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had discovered and terrified of how it might change everything they thought they knew about their family's history. "Mom, I need to ask you about Grandpa Tommy's ring," Sophia said, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her mother with the urgent energy of someone who could no longer contain an explosive secret. "The phoenix ring you wear around your neck. I need to know everything you can remember about where it came from, who gave it to him, anything at all. It's important, more important than I ever imagined possible." Linda's hand instinctively moved to her chest, where the familiar weight of the ring rested beneath her soft cotton sweater, hidden but always present like a talisman against the uncertainties of life. "Why are you asking about the ring now?" Linda asked, her voice careful and measured in the way that suggested she already suspected this conversation was going to be more complicated than either of them wanted it to be. "Has something happened? You're scaring me, sweetheart. You never ask about your grandfather's things unless something's really bothering you." There was a note of maternal intuition in her voice, the same sixth sense that had always allowed her to know when Sophia was hiding something, or struggling with problems she thought were too big for adult intervention. Sophia took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts into something that would make sense, trying to find words that could adequately convey the surreal nature of her encounter with Marcus Blackwood and its potential implications for everything they believed about their family's past. "Today at the diner, a customer came in wearing a ring exactly like yours. Not similar, Mom, exactly like it, down to every detail, every engraving, every tiny garnet in the phoenix's eyes. I've studied your ring my whole life, traced every line with my fingers since I was little, and this was identical in every possible way. When I mentioned that you had one just like it, he accused our family of being thieves." The words tumbled out in a rush, and Sophia watched her mother's face change from confusion to recognition to something that looked disturbingly like fear. Linda's hand tightened around the ring beneath her sweater, as if someone might try to take it away from her at any moment, and Sophia could see her mother's mind racing, making connections and drawing conclusions that she couldn't yet share. There was something in Linda's expression that suggested this moment had been anticipated, dreaded, prepared for in some deep corner of her consciousness that had never stopped expecting the past to come calling with demands for explanations and accountability. "What was this man's name?" Linda asked quietly, her voice taking on a quality that Sophia had never heard before, something hollow and distant that suggested she was already beginning to piece together connections that her daughter couldn't yet see. "Did he tell you his name? Was he young? Old? Did he seem to know anything about our family?" The questions came with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered, that the difference between salvation and destruction might lie in seemingly insignificant particulars. Sophia pulled out Marcus's business card and placed it on the table between them, the elegant cardstock looking almost obscene against their simple kitchen table, with its worn formica surface and mismatched placemats that Linda had collected over the years from garage sales and thrift stores. The contrast between the expensive business card and their humble surroundings seemed to emphasize the vast gulf between their world and the one Marcus Blackwood inhabited, a reminder of just how unequal this confrontation was likely to be. Linda stared at the card for a long moment, her face going pale in a way that had nothing to do with her illness and everything to do with recognition and old fears suddenly awakening after decades of dormancy. She picked up the card with trembling fingers, studying it as if it might suddenly burst into flames or transform into something even more threatening. "Blackwood," she whispered, the name sounding like a curse in her mouth. "Oh God, I never thought, after all these years, I never imagined they would come looking for us. I thought we were safe, thought enough time had passed that they would never connect the dots." Her voice trailed off as she seemed to retreat into memories that Sophia could only guess at, connections forming in her mind that painted a picture her daughter couldn't yet see, but instinctively feared. "Mom, you're scaring me," Sophia said, reaching across the table to take her mother's trembling hand, feeling the fragile bones beneath skin that seemed almost translucent in the afternoon light filtering through their kitchen window. What does that name mean to you? How do you know it? Did something happen with the Blackwoods that you never told me about?" The questions poured out with increasing urgency as Sophia realized that her mother's reaction was confirming her worst fears about the morning's encounter. Linda looked up at her daughter with eyes that suddenly seemed decades older, filled with the weight of secrets she had hoped never to share and stories she had prayed would remain buried in the past where they belonged. There was a moment of internal struggle visible on her face, the conflict between a mother's instinct to protect her child and the recognition that protection was no longer possible, that the time for comfortable lies and partial truths had finally ended. "Your grandfather never told me the whole truth," Linda said slowly, her voice taking on the careful cadence of someone revealing long-hidden secrets. "I knew something terrible had happened to him in the late 70s, something that broke his spirit and eventually killed him, but he protected me from the details. He said it was better if I didn't know, safer for me and for you when you came along. He was always trying to shield the people he loved from the darkness in the world, even when that darkness was consuming him." She paused, gathering strength for revelations that would change both of their lives forever. "But there were things he couldn't hide completely," Linda continued, her voice growing steadier as she committed to the path of full disclosure. "Papers I found after he died, fragments of conversations I overheard when he thought I was sleeping, phone calls that made him pace the floor for hours afterward, legal documents with letterheads I didn't recognize, technical drawings with notations in handwriting that wasn't his, correspondence that mentioned names and companies he claimed never to have heard of." She was building a picture of systematic deception and hidden knowledge, of a man who had tried to protect his family by keeping them ignorant of forces that were destroying him from within. "The Blackwood family destroyed your grandfather," Linda continued, her voice growing stronger as anger began to override fear, as the protective instincts that had sustained her through decades of hardship finally found a target worthy of their full force. They wanted his water purification patents, the technology he had spent 10 years developing, perfecting, testing in every condition he could imagine. It wasn't just an invention to him. It was his life's work, his contribution to humanity, his way of honoring the country that had given him opportunities his parents never could have dreamed of. He genuinely believed it could save millions of lives, provide clean water to places that had never had it before, turn deserts into gardens and transform the developing world. Sophia listened with growing horror as her mother painted a picture of corporate greed and calculated cruelty that seemed almost too extreme to be real, too cartoonishly evil for the complex world she thought she understood. But the pain in Linda's voice was unmistakable, the weight of old wounds that had never properly healed, and Sophia realized she was finally hearing the true story of her family's tragedy. When Blackwood Industries first approached him, they offered what seemed like a reasonable partnership, Linda explained, her words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken, and years of suppressed truth were finally finding their way into the light. They had the manufacturing capabilities, the distribution networks, the political connections to make his dream a reality on a global scale. "Your grandfather was brilliant with technology, but he was naive about business, about the ways powerful people use contracts and legal language to trap and control inventors. He thought they wanted to work with him, to help him change the world. He had no idea they simply wanted to own him." "What happened?" Sophia asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the broad outlines of the story. "Why didn't the partnership work out? What went wrong?" Linda's laugh was bitter and painful, an echo of the sound Marcus had made in the diner that morning when he dismissed the possibility that their family could be anything other than thieves or frauds. "Because your grandfather was an idealist who believed in fair dealing and honest partnerships," Linda replied, her voice heavy with the wisdom that came from watching integrity collide with ruthless ambition. "He wanted to retain partial ownership of his patents, wanted guarantees that the technology would be made available to developing countries at cost, wanted oversight to ensure quality control and proper implementation. Reasonable requests from the man who had invented the entire system, who understood its capabilities and limitations better than anyone else in the world. But the Blackwoods didn't want a partner. They wanted complete ownership, total control, maximum profit with minimum accountability." The story was unfolding exactly as Sophia had feared, a tale of power overwhelming integrity, wealth crushing innovation, the strong preying on the weak with the kind of casual cruelty that came from viewing other human beings as obstacles to be removed rather than partners to be respected. It was a story she had heard in different forms throughout her life, but never with her own family cast in the role of the victims. "When your grandfather refused to sign over complete rights to his patents, that's when things turned ugly," Linda continued, her voice now steady with the strength that came from finally speaking truth she had carried alone for too long. "Legal challenges appeared overnight, questioning the validity of his patents, claiming prior art that didn't exist, tying him up in court battles he couldn't afford to fight. Patent lawyers who had seemed eager to work with him suddenly became unavailable or doubled their fees. Bureaucratic roadblocks suddenly appeared everywhere. Permits were delayed or denied. Regulatory approvals were mysteriously held up by officials who had previously seemed supportive of his work. And then came the personal threats, Linda added, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she relived memories that still had the power to terrify her decades later. The words hung in the air between them like poisonous smoke, contaminating the safe space of their kitchen with echoes of old fears and barely contained violence. "What kind of threats?" Sophia asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The comfortable world of her childhood, built on stories of her grandfather's genius and integrity, was crumbling around her, replaced by something darker and more complex than she had ever imagined. Phone calls in the middle of the night, warning him that accidents could happen to stubborn men who didn't know when to accept generous offers, Linda replied, her hand moving again to the ring beneath her sweater, drawing comfort from its familiar presence like a talisman against the memories that still haunted her dreams. Cars following him to work, men in expensive suits showing up at his job site asking questions about his family, his wife, his daughter. They made it clear that his refusal to cooperate wasn't just putting himself at risk, that the people he loved most could pay the price for his stubbornness. Linda's voice broke slightly on the last words, and Sophia could see the guilt her mother still carried, the belief that somehow her grandfather's love for his family had been used as a weapon against him, that his greatest strength had become his most exploitable weakness. It was a burden that had shaped Linda's entire approach to life, her determination to keep their family small and quiet and invisible to the kinds of people who wielded power without conscience. "That's when he gave me the ring," Linda said, pulling the chain from beneath her sweater and holding the phoenix up to catch the afternoon light streaming through their kitchen window. The garnets in the phoenix's eyes seemed to glow with inner fire, just as they had on Marcus's identical ring that morning, and Sophia stared at it with new understanding of its significance. He said it was from someone who understood what it meant to fight against impossible odds, someone who believed in him when the whole world seemed to be turning against him. He said it represented hope, the promise that even when everything seemed lost, there was always the possibility of rising from the ashes stronger than before. The symbolism was almost overwhelming, and Sophia found herself studying the ring with new eyes, seeing not just a beautiful piece of jewelry, but a symbol of resistance and solidarity in the face of overwhelming power. The phoenix rising from flames took on new meaning when viewed as a message from someone who understood the cost of fighting against forces that seemed impossible to defeat. "Who gave it to him?" Sophia asked, studying the ring with intense focus, as if its secrets might suddenly reveal themselves under sufficient scrutiny. "Did he tell you who this person was? Someone from inside Blackwood Industries?" Linda shook her head, frustration clear in her expression as she confronted the limitations of her own knowledge about events that had shaped their family's destiny. "He was careful never to mention names, never to give me details that could put me at risk if anyone came asking questions," Linda replied, her voice heavy with the weight of protection that had come at the cost of understanding. "But there were hints, fragments of conversations, references to someone on the inside who was trying to help him fight back, someone with access to information, someone who understood how the Blackwoods operated and was willing to take enormous personal risks to stop them." She paused, studying the ring as if it might suddenly reveal its secrets after all these years of silence. "What happened to the patents?" Sophia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The story was following a depressingly familiar pattern, one that played out countless times when individual inventors found themselves facing corporate giants with unlimited resources and flexible ethics. Did they manage to steal them? Linda's nod was both confirmation and condemnation, an acknowledgement of injustice that had never been corrected or even properly acknowledged by anyone with the power to make a difference. 6 months after your grandfather's death, Blackwood Industries announced a revolutionary new water purification system, Linda said, her voice thick with the bitterness of old wounds that had never properly healed. The technology was identical to your grandfather's patents, down to the smallest technical details, but they claimed it was the result of their own research and development. They had teams of lawyers and experts ready to swear that any similarities to previous work were purely coincidental, that great minds simply thought alike when faced with similar challenges. The phone rang then, startling them both out of their intense conversation, and Sophia looked at the caller ID to see Marcus Blackwood's name displayed on the screen. The timing felt almost supernatural, as if their conversation had somehow summoned him back into their lives, just as they were beginning to understand the true scope of what they were facing. She looked at her mother, who nodded with the grim determination of someone who had decided it was finally time to stop running from ghosts that had haunted their family for far too long. "Answer it," Linda said quietly, her voice carrying the strength that came from finally choosing confrontation over concealment. "It's time we got some answers of our own." "Mr. Blackwood," Sophia said as she picked up the phone, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotional turmoil of the last hour. "I was just talking with my mother about the ring." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Marcus spoke, his voice had lost much of its earlier arrogance, replaced by something that sounded almost like uncertainty mixed with genuine concern. The transformation was so complete that Sophia wondered if she was speaking to the same man who had so casually accused her family of theft just hours earlier. "Miss Chen, I've spent the last 2 hours going through my family's archives, and I need to speak with you and your mother as soon as possible," Marcus said, his words coming fast as if he were racing against time or his own courage to make this call. "There are things about this situation that neither of us understood this morning, documents and correspondence that paint a very different picture of what happened between our families. I'm afraid the truth is more complicated and more disturbing than either of our families realize." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Sophia could only begin to guess at, but instinctively feared. "Would it be possible for me to come to you?" Marcus continued, his tone now carrying a note of genuine respect that had been completely absent during their confrontation at the diner. "I have documents I think you need to see. Evidence that suggests both of our families have been living with incomplete and possibly deliberately distorted versions of what actually happened in the 1970s. Your grandfather's name appears in correspondence I never knew existed, and the implications are—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words adequate to convey the magnitude of what he had discovered. Sophia looked at her mother, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand the request, and saw Linda nod with the expression of someone who had finally decided to stop hiding from ghosts that had haunted her family for too long. There was steel in her mother's eyes now, the same determination that had sustained her through nursing school, single motherhood, and her current battle with cancer. "Yes," Sophia said into the phone. "Come over. It's time we all learned the truth." 45 minutes later, Marcus Blackwood stood in the doorway of their modest apartment, looking profoundly out of place in his expensive suit among their second-hand furniture and carefully maintained but obviously aged possessions. He carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than their monthly rent, but his usual confidence seemed to have deserted him entirely. Instead of the arrogant billionaire who had dismissed their family's integrity that morning, he appeared almost vulnerable, a man confronting the possibility that everything he had believed about his own family's legacy might be built on foundations of sand and lies. The rain had followed him in, droplets clinging to his perfectly styled hair and expensive coat, making him seem more human and less like the untouchable corporate titan he had appeared to be in the diner. "Mrs. Chen," he said, approaching Linda with a deference that surprised Sophia with its apparent sincerity. "I owe you and your family an apology that I'm not sure words can adequately convey. What I discovered in my family's archives this afternoon has forced me to confront some very uncomfortable truths about the Blackwood legacy and our treatment of your father." Linda studied him with the assessing gaze of someone who had learned through hard experience to judge people by their actions rather than their words, but she gestured for him to sit down at their small kitchen table, the same table where she had shared so many meals and conversations with her daughter, where homework had been completed and dreams had been discussed and life had been lived in all its ordinary, precious detail. "Before we begin," Marcus said, opening his briefcase and removing a stack of documents that looked official and important, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you changes everything I thought I knew about my family's history. These documents were in my grandfather William Blackwood's private safe, correspondence and reports that were never meant to be seen by anyone outside the immediate family. I only found them because I was searching for evidence to support my accusation against your family. Instead, I found proof of something far worse." His hands shook slightly as he spoke, the weight of what he had discovered clearly affecting him on a level that went beyond mere embarrassment or professional concern. He spread the documents across the table with hands that weren't entirely steady, and Sophia could see that they were a mixture of official letterheads, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be surveillance reports complete with photographs and detailed observations. The sight of her grandfather's name appearing throughout the correspondence sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. There were photos of Tommy Chen that she had never seen before, candid shots taken from a distance showing him walking to work, entering buildings, speaking with colleagues, completely unaware that his every movement was being documented by strangers with unknown motives. "This is a private investigative report commissioned by my grandfather in 1977, Marcus said, pointing to a document that was stamped with the logo of a security firm that Sophia had never heard of, but which looked expensive and discreet. It details every aspect of your grandfather's life, his work habits, his family relationships, his financial situation, even his daily routines. They followed him for months, documented everyone he spoke with, every meeting he attended, every patent application he filed. The invasion of privacy was breathtaking in its scope and thoroughness, and Sophia felt physically ill imagining her grandfather going about his daily life, unaware that strangers were cataloging his every movement with the clinical detachment of scientists studying a laboratory specimen. The reports were exhaustively detailed, documenting not just Tommy Chen's professional activities, but personal information that should have been private and sacred. They knew what time he left for work each morning, which route he took, where he bought his lunch, how much he spent on groceries, which neighbors he spoke with, and for how long. They had investigated his marriage, his immigration history, his financial records, his medical appointments, creating a complete picture of a man's life that was both intimate and deeply violating. But this is where it gets truly disturbing, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as he pulled out a series of handwritten memos on Blackwood Industries letterhead. These are instructions from my grandfather to various employees and contractors, outlining a systematic campaign to isolate your grandfather professionally and personally. Patent challenges filed not because they had merit, but to drain his resources. Regulatory complaints designed to tie up his approvals in bureaucratic red tape. Even pressure applied to his employer to create workplace difficulties. The memos were written in a cold, business-like tone that made their cruelty even more chilling, as if the destruction of a human being's life and dreams was just another item on a corporate to-do list. Linda leaned forward to examine the documents more closely, her trained nurse's eye scanning them with the methodical precision she had once applied to medical charts. This memo talks about neutralizing the Chen threat and ensuring compliance through escalating pressure, she read aloud, her voice growing colder with each word. They weren't trying to negotiate with my father. They were trying to destroy him systematically, methodically, like he was some kind of enemy combatant instead of an inventor trying to help people get clean water. The clinical language of corporate warfare couldn't disguise the human cost of what had been planned and executed with such methodical cruelty. It gets worse, Marcus said, pulling out another set of documents that made Sophia's blood run cold when she saw her grandmother's name and address listed alongside detailed information about her daily activities and vulnerabilities. They investigated your entire family, looking for pressure points they could exploit. Your grandmother's immigration status, your mother's school records, even your grandfather's medical history was scrutinized for anything they could use as leverage. The violation felt almost physical, as if strangers had been rummaging through their most private moments and intimate fears, looking for weapons to use against people whose only crime was refusing to surrender their dignity and principles. The files contained information that made Sophia's skin crawl with their invasive detail. They knew about her grandmother's fear of deportation, despite her legal status. They knew about Linda's struggles in school, her dreams of becoming a nurse, her relationship with her father. They had compiled a psychological profile of Tommy Chen that analyzed his motivations, his weaknesses, his deepest fears, all with the goal of finding the most effective ways to break his spirit and force his compliance. But here's what I don't understand, Marcus continued, his confusion evident as he pulled out a document that seemed different from the others. This is a memo from someone codenamed Phoenix who appears to have been feeding information to your grandfather about Blackwood Industries' plans, internal documents, legal strategies, even advance warning about some of the pressure tactics they were planning to use. Someone inside my family's organization was actively working to help your grandfather fight back. The memo was written in a different hand than the others, with an urgency and emotion that suggested personal investment rather than professional duty. Sophia felt her heart skip a beat at the mention of the Phoenix, and she saw her mother's hand instinctively move to the ring beneath her sweater. Phoenix, Linda repeated, her voice barely audible. Your grandfather always said the ring came from someone who understood what it meant to rise from the ashes, someone who was fighting their own battles against impossible odds. The symbolism was too perfect to be coincidental, and all three of them recognized the connection simultaneously, the missing piece of a puzzle that had haunted their family for decades. There's more, Marcus said, his voice heavy with implications, as he pulled out what appeared to be a copy of a birth certificate and several legal documents that looked older and more official than the surveillance reports. I found these in the same safe, hidden behind a false back that I almost missed completely. This is a birth certificate for Daniel Blackwood, born in 1925, which would make him my grandfather William's younger brother. But according to all the family records I've ever seen, William was an only child. Daniel Blackwood doesn't exist in any official family history, any family trees, any corporate records. It's as if he was deliberately erased from our family's existence. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, changing the entire landscape of what they thought they understood about the connections between their families. Sophia studied the birth certificate, noting the official seals and stamps that seemed to authenticate its legitimacy, while her mind raced to process the implications of a deliberately erased family member. The document looked genuine, complete with hospital records and parental signatures, but its very existence contradicted decades of carefully maintained family mythology. Why would they hide the existence of a brother? Linda asked, voicing the question that was on all of their minds. What could Daniel have done that would make them want to erase him from family history completely? In my experience, families only go to such extreme lengths when someone has committed an unforgivable betrayal. Marcus shook his head, his expression troubled as he contemplated possibilities that grew darker with each passing moment. I don't know yet, but I found this tucked inside the birth certificate, Marcus replied, unfolding a handwritten letter that was yellowed with age and written in the careful script of someone who knew their words would be dangerous if discovered. The paper was fragile, handled with obvious care over the years, and the ink had faded to a soft brown that spoke of decades hidden away from light and air. It's dated 1978, just months before your grandfather's death, and it's signed DB. The letter talks about fighting the family business, protecting innocent people, and ensuring the truth survives even if we don't. He paused, letting the implications of those words sink in before continuing. The letter was clearly written by someone who knew they were in danger, someone who understood that their actions had consequences that might prove fatal. I think Daniel Blackwood was Phoenix, and I think he was trying to help your grandfather expose what Blackwood Industries was doing to inventors and small businesses. But more than that, I think he was documenting everything, creating a record that could be used to hold the family accountable if anything happened to him. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in ways that painted a picture of family conflict and moral courage that neither Sophia nor her mother had ever imagined possible. The idea that someone from within the Blackwood family had risked everything to fight against their own relatives' cruelty added layers of complexity to a story they had always seen in simple terms of good versus evil. It suggested that even in the most corrupt organizations, individual conscience could still assert itself, even at tremendous personal cost. But what happened to him? Sophia asked, studying the letter with growing unease as she noticed the desperate tone of the writing, the sense of someone running out of time and options. If Daniel was helping Grandpa fight back, where did he go? Why isn't there any trace of him after 1978? Did he just disappear, or? She couldn't bring herself to voice the darker possibilities that were occurring to all of them. Marcus's expression grew even more troubled as he pulled out the final document from his briefcase, a death certificate that made Sophia's hands shake when she read the date. The certificate was official, bearing all the proper seals and signatures, but something about it felt wrong, too convenient, too perfectly timed to be entirely believable. Daniel Blackwood died in a car accident in December 1978, just 3 months after your grandfather's heart attack, Marcus said quietly, his voice heavy with the implications of the timing. Single-car collision on a remote mountain road, no witnesses, no explanation for why he was in that area. The police report calls it an accident, but given everything else I've found, I have serious doubts about that conclusion. The suggestion of murder hung unspoken between them, too terrible to voice directly but impossible to ignore, given the pattern of ruthless behavior they had already documented. The timing was too perfect, the circumstances too convenient, the lack of witnesses too fortunate for the surviving Blackwood family members. It painted a picture of a family willing to kill their own blood to protect their secrets and maintain their power. Linda reached across the table and took the death certificate with trembling hands, studying it as if it might reveal secrets beyond the stark facts of Daniel Blackwood's final moments. He died fighting for what was right, she said finally, her voice carrying a mixture of grief for a man she had never met and gratitude for his sacrifice. He gave his life trying to protect my father and expose the truth about what your family was doing to innocent people. That makes him a hero, no matter what name he was born with. Which brings us back to the rings, Marcus said, his own hand moving unconsciously to touch the phoenix on his finger. I think Daniel commissioned both rings, one for himself and one for your grandfather, as symbols of their alliance against my family's corruption. When Daniel died, someone made sure your grandfather received both rings, but your grandfather was so devastated by his friend's death that he could only bear to keep one. The other ring somehow made its way back to the family, probably through Daniel's personal effects. The theory made emotional sense, explaining both the identical rings and the deep significance they had held for Tommy Chen. It also explained why the ring had been so precious to their family, not just as a beautiful piece of jewelry, but as a tangible connection to someone who had died trying to help them fight an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. "But where is Daniel's ring now?" Sophia asked, looking at Marcus with sudden understanding. "If Grandpa only kept one ring, and you're wearing the other one, how did your ring end up back with the Blackwood family?" Marcus looked down at his hand with an expression of dawning horror as the implications of her question became clear. "I inherited this ring from my grandfather William," Marcus said slowly, his voice barely audible as he confronted a truth that made him physically ill. "He told me it was a family heirloom, passed down through generations of Blackwoods who had built our fortune through hard work and innovation. He said it represented the phoenix spirit of our family, our ability to rise from setbacks and create something greater. But if this is Daniel's ring—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but the conclusion was unavoidable and damning. "Then your grandfather didn't just arrange Daniel's murder," Linda said, completing the thought with the clinical precision of someone stating a medical diagnosis. "He took Daniel's ring as a trophy, a reminder of his victory over the one member of his family who had tried to do the right thing. And then he passed it down to you as if it represented honor instead of betrayal, legacy instead of blood money." The weight of generational guilt settled on Marcus's shoulders like a physical burden, and Sophia could see him struggling to process the magnitude of his family's crimes. The realization seemed to age Marcus visibly, the confident billionaire replaced by a man confronting the possibility that his entire life had been built on a foundation of murder and theft. Every success, every achievement, every moment of pride in the Blackwood name was now tainted by the knowledge of what his grandfather had been willing to do to maintain power and control. "I need to make this right," Marcus said finally, his voice stronger now as he found his resolve. "I can't undo what my family did to yours, but I can ensure that the truth finally comes to light. I want to establish a foundation in your grandfather's name, funded by Blackwood Industries, to support inventors and small businesses fighting against corporate theft. I want to endow research chairs at major universities focused on water purification technology. I want to create legal aid funds for families facing the kind of intimidation your grandfather experienced." He began removing the ring from his finger, but Linda stopped him with a gentle touch. "Keep the ring," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who understood that symbols derived their power from the intentions of those who wore them. "But wear it to remember Daniel Blackwood's courage, not your grandfather's cruelty. Use it to remind yourself every day of the choice between doing what's profitable and doing what's right. Let it be a symbol of redemption instead of a trophy of conquest." Marcus nodded, tears in his eyes as he understood the magnitude of the gift she was offering him, the chance at redemption that he didn't deserve but desperately needed. As they sat around the small kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of decades-old crimes and the possibility of finally achieving justice, Sophia felt something shifting in the universe around them. The truth had a power of its own, a weight that could crush lies and expose corruption even when it seemed hopelessly buried beneath layers of wealth and influence. Her grandfather's death had not been in vain if it ultimately led to this moment of reckoning, this chance for both families to confront their history and choose a better path forward. The afternoon light was fading outside their kitchen window, casting long shadows across the documents that had changed everything. But inside the small apartment there was a sense of illumination, of secrets finally exposed to the cleansing power of truth. The Phoenix rings, once symbols of a desperate alliance between two men fighting against impossible odds, had become something greater. Proof that courage and integrity could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy them, and that sometimes the truth waited decades for the right moment to rise from the ashes and claim its victory. In the weeks that followed, the story would explode across news outlets and social media, inspiring other families to come forward with their own stories of corporate intimidation and theft. The Thomas Chen Foundation would become a powerful force for protecting individual inventors and small businesses. And two families, once divided by lies and manipulation, would find a way to honor both their shared tragedy and their hope for a more just future. If this story touched your heart and opened your eyes to the power of truth over corruption, please show your support. Hit that like button to help spread this message of justice and redemption. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in the power of ordinary people to fight extraordinary wrong. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts about corporate greed versus family courage. We want to hear your voice. And don't forget to share this story with everyone you know, because stories like this need to be told and retold until justice becomes the norm, not the exception. Together, we can ensure that no family's truth remains buried forever.